Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. We are finally here. Mike Norvell, Florida State, kicking off spring practice, and you're starting to get a feel, and it's early. That's probably what we have to stress first. It's early, but you're getting a feel for the guys that had really good off seasons in terms of winter workouts, what they were doing in the weight room, how they got their body right, and you're starting to get a feel for what players are translating that to the football field going into 2025. Now, to address the elephant in the room, and I see you guys putting this in the comment section plenty. Go back to last year. We heard really good things out of spring practice. We heard really good things out of fall camp. Obviously, those good things did not translate to what we saw with this Florida State team in the 2024 year. As skeptical as I am, and I'm sure many of you all are too, I wouldn't use that and just say we're not going to care about what we hear from spring practice, because the truth of the matter is, although that was really frustrating last year, go back to how they talked about Jordan Travis. Go back to how they talked about a guy like Jared Verse or a guy like Braden Fisk. Normally, when you hear good things out of spring practice, you see it on the football field in the fall. And so we do have some things that I think are worth noting coming out of this first spring practice. And hey, whenever I get an opportunity to talk Florida State football, especially with this football team that has so many changes, we're going to talk about it. Before we get into it, as always, the Florida State fans, appreciate you guys. It's been a really busy offseason, right? A lot of new faces, a lot of new coaches, a lot of different ways this Florida State team is going about operating. I've had a blast talking about it. It's going to be really fun talking about it during spring practice. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with just some overall thoughts. Now, Florida State has closed down spring practice to the media, so we get just a different vantage point in terms of what's happening on the football field. The biggest takeaway that I'm getting, and this is something we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, is there's significant changes going on within this program. We've talked about in terms of, hey, how do we want to build this roster? Our evaluation process, not only at the high school ranks, but how we're evaluating players in the transfer portal. We've seen significant changes from how Florida State wants to build their roster. We've seen some significant changes to the coaching staff, significant changes to the roster from a personnel standpoint. One of the other really big changes is, Mike Norvell talked about this. A couple other players who took the press conference stand also talked about it. From a operation standpoint during practice, practice looks and feels different. All of these things are good, in my opinion. We use the analogy of the Michigan team in 2020, and I'm a Michigan fan, so I had a front row seat to this. Michigan in 2020 was a disaster, right? And obviously COVID might have played a part, but you could tell that Michigan and how they were doing things leading up to that 2020 year, it was not great. There were some underlying issues, but Michigan kept winning games previous to the 2020 year, so you didn't see a ton of significant changes. That 2020 year where Michigan just kind of cratered out, it forced Jim Harbaugh to make some significant changes in terms of how this program was going to be run. I see very similar things with Florida State, where even when we've talked about this, even when Florida State was winning a lot of football games, there were things that we had question marks about. Well, when you have a season where you go 2-10, especially after an undefeated season in 2023, it forces you to make changes, and we're seeing that play out with Florida State, which I think is a good thing if you're a Florida State fan. Now, the number one storyline here is you feel pretty good about what this Florida State secondary is. And I'll tell you why I feel confident in this Florida State secondary. I think there's going to be a lot of people who follow this program and follow this sport pretty closely and looking at me and say, you lose Fentrell Cypress, you lose a guy like AZ Thomas. How could you possibly get up there and say you have confidence in the secondary when Florida State did not go to the transfer portal at all to replace some of the talent? Well, I'll say this. Florida State didn't go to the transfer portal, in my opinion, to address the secondary because they know what they have in that room. Look, if Florida State didn't think they had a good secondary, they would have addressed it like they did every other position on this football field. That's the one position that they've recruited well, they've developed well, and although they don't have a new name coming into this program in the secondary, you feel pretty good about what the secondary is going to be, and you're starting to hear early returns. Jabril Rawls, a guy like Earl Little. I'm looking at my notes, Edwin Joseph. I mean, guys that maybe aren't household names right now because you had guys like Fentrell Cypress and AZ Thomas. Those guys we knew were good football players. Florida State has done a very good job developing that talent in the back end. When you have good football players with good talent development, chances are you don't need to use the transfer portal to fix your roster at that position group. And I think that's where we sit with Florida State in the secondary. Feel good about the secondary. I felt good about it heading into spring practice. Mike Norvell talked about those guys standing out. You have some optimism about what Florida State's going to be. Shamar, no, by the way, I believe up to 195 pounds. That's a true freshman that might play early for Florida State. I would just keep an eye on him. Number 2, running backs look good, and this is a really big storyline. If I'm a Florida State fan, is what's the rushing attack look like? And there's a lot of driving factors that push me towards this rushing attack could be pretty good for Florida State, or should be pretty good for Florida State in 2025, which is arguably the biggest storyline we have for this offense, where you go back to 2024, you could not run the football. Were in a lot of third and longs. You couldn't protect the passer. That's a recipe for disaster on the offensive side of the football. Why do we feel good about Florida State running the football better? No, number one, I think the running backs are probably better than we think, because last year was like they just didn't have a chance behind that offensive line. Cam Davis lost some weight, and he talked about how he feels a little bit lighter, a little bit more elusive. Look, we know Cam Davis can run the football physically. Him being a little bit lighter, I should say. He ain't a light kid. He's 217 pounds. Him being a little bit smaller and lighter, I think, is going to help his game. Roydell Williams, a guy that we heard great things from last year, you're continuing to hear all those really good things going into 2025 as well. And again, we think these running backs are good. And then Jalen Lucas, who I think can be the definition of an X factor as a running back, pass catcher, gadget player. Gus Malzahn knows how to use these kind of guys. And Jalen Lucas sounds like he's back to 100%, and he's back to being that just absolute difference maker that I remember, just running around a Michigan defense back at his time at Indiana. This kid has a ton of juice, and if he's used the right way and put in positions to make plays and be successful, he's not going to be a guy that runs the ball 20 times a game, but he's going to be a guy that can fundamentally change a football game for you on the offensive side of the football. And I got confidence that Gus Malzahn can use him the right way. The second thing is this offensive line is completely revamped, and it's big and physical, right? And so we like the running back room. We're hearing good things about the running back room. We significantly like the offensive line better. And then the cherry on top is that there's just not many better coaches in the country that design a run game better than Gus Malzahn. Combine that with Thomas Castellanos, who's an infinitely better runner and better in the run game, I should say, than a guy like DJU. And so the Florida State rushing attack, there's a lot of reasons to believe that this can be massively improved, and actually a strength of this football team in the 2025 year, which is a stark difference between what we saw in 2024 when Florida State was the worst Power 4 team in the country running the football. Number 3, Amari Williams looks right. And we've talked about Amari Williams a lot. He's probably the player I'm most excited for on the defensive side of the football, making the position change, going from tight end to playing that jack linebacker role. I saw, and this is just me going off a picture that I saw from him walking into spring practice. He looks like a jack linebacker. He looks like a guy that can be an all-conference dude, and he is a perfect fit from a skill set standpoint. You look at that jack linebacker, and some Florida State fans ask some question marks about that jack linebacker position in the Tony White defense. Essentially, what you're looking at is kind of a hybrid here. He's going to rush the passer off the edge. He's going to line up on the line of scrimmage pretty consistently. And at times, you'll be asked to play the run. At times, you'll be asked to rush the passer. But at the same time, you're going to have a little bit more responsibility dropping back in coverage and playing in space. Amari Williams is that the perfect guy. There's not a lot of guys that have the athleticism, that size speed combination to play along the line of scrimmage, rush the passer, stop the run, and drop back in coverage. Amari Williams is that guy, and he's reshaped his body so he has the physicality required to play along the line of scrimmage. This is just me going off a body type standpoint. Amari Williams could be an absolute stud for Florida State. And you saw that consistently. There's a lot of guys that you look at and say, yeah, that's a perfect fit in the Tony White defense. Amari Williams is that guy. Going up to the last storyline here, and that is quarterback play. And we don't have a ton of info. You know, we all expect Thomas Castellanos to be the quarterback one. He fits the Gus Malzahn system extremely well. Again, going back to that fundamental change in terms of how Florida State has built this football team, we're not only going to try to get good football players to come in, we're trying to get good football players that fit what we want to do. Similar to how we talked about Amari Williams being made in a laboratory to play Jack linebacker, we say the same thing for Thomas Castellanos in the Gus Malzahn offense. Now, Thomas Castellanos, you go up and put him in the Ohio State offense, or you go up and put him in the Lincoln Riley offense at USC, probably wouldn't be all that good of a fit. But in the Gus Malzahn offense, to me, it's an electric fit. It's a perfect fit. And so you're hearing some good things, not only from Thomas Castellanos from a fit standpoint, but from a leadership standpoint. I don't want to talk too much about that, but you go back to DJU and the circumstances surrounding DJU, getting a lot of money to come to Florida State, believe he lived out really far from campus. It was like not really totally part of the team, it seemed like, for DJU. You get a better fit that or feel that Thomas Castellanos is the guy running this offense. You heard some really good things about true freshman Kevin Sperry, too, who needs a year or two to physically put himself together as a college football quarterback. The kid's a gamer. You know, Oklahoma loved him, and they were really happy to have him in his class. And Florida State came in late and kind of swooped him away. Give him a year or two, very similar to how we talk about Trevor Jackson. And let's just see what these quarterbacks look like going into 2026 and 2027. Good things early on from Florida State. And again, we're all using the same approach here, and that is cautious optimism. But I think there's a lot of good things that you're hearing from Florida State coming out of winter workouts, rolling into spring practice. We'll continue to update the conversation. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.